Hey guys, it's Miss Hall here with the second video for our first unit of Boost. This is, remember, our unit on the book 13 Reasons Why. And as we go through the unit, I'm going to share some videos with you that give you some information that will help you understand the book. Now today, our video is going to focus on the different elements of a story. We're going to talk about narrator and plot and characters and conflict and moral and theme and setting. All of those different elements that make up a story. These are things that you will find in every single piece of fiction that you read. So it's really important that you understand how to identify them and how to talk about them. First off, today we're going to talk about narrator, and you'll remember that a narrator is the person telling the story. And when we talk about narrator, what we're talking about is point of view of the narrator. And usually in fiction, the narrator is either first person or third person point of view. First person is when the narrator is a character in the story, and they're telling the story from within using pronouns like I or we. Third person is when the narrator is outside of the story, and sometimes that third person narrator is all-knowing or omniscient, meaning they're outside the story, but they know everything that's going on with all the characters, all their thoughts, all their feelings, all their actions. You may also have a limited third person, which is a narrator that's outside the story but only knows part of the story. They may follow one character around or only know what's going on in one space. Second person is not very often used in fiction. It's when the narrator is addressing the audience. It's usually when giving instructions or directions, and it uses the pronoun you. But first and third person are really what you'll most often find when you're reading fiction. Perhaps the most important story element is the plot. The plot is what's happening. It's the sequence of events in the story. And we usually break it down into the introduction, which is where the author kind of sets the scene and introduces the characters. The rising action, that's that build up of action and one event leading to another, leading to another. And that all builds up to the climax, which is kind of the high point, the point of most suspense or most action or the most kind of turning point in the story where things sort of start to change. And then we have the falling action, which is just those few things that happen as a result of the climax. And then the resolution, that's kind of the end of the story. It's the what happened next, sometimes and they all lived happily ever after, or didn't. That's the resolution. It tells us what happens after the story. The next important story element is characters. Every story has to have characters. These are the people or animals, sometimes even objects, that are acting in the story. Now, most stories have major and minor characters. The major characters are the ones that the story is focused around and that are most important, and the minor are those other characters that are part of the story but not quite as important. In most stories, we have a protagonist and an antagonist. The protagonist is the main good guy in the story. He's the one the story is mostly about, and the antagonist is the one who opposes the protagonist, that's causing problems for them for one reason or another. The author reveals these characters to us through a process known as characterization. So characterization is the way that the author reveals information to the reader about the characters. And this might be direct, meaning the author directly tells you things about the character. It might say something like, he was an angry boy with flaming eyes. Or it could be indirect, where the author reveals things about the character through his actions or through the thoughts and feelings of others. So rather than telling you that he was angry, the author might have him frequently yelling or might have other people be afraid of him. And that would tell us that the character was angry without directly saying it, and that's called indirect characterization. Characterization is a tool that the author uses to teach you about the characters. Another very important part of a story is the conflict. And the conflict is the struggle between opposing forces. This is kind of what drives the plot of the story. It's usually revealed during the rising action, and it's solved during the resolution of a story. And there are four main types of conflict that you'll find in fiction stories. Character versus self. These are those conflicts where a character is struggling with an internal decision. Should I change schools or should I stay stay at my school? Should I break up with my boyfriend, or should I stay with him? Those are character versus self conflicts. Character versus nature conflicts, these are really popular in adventure stories where a character is stranded in the wild and they have to survive. Character versus nature could also be when a person is facing bad weather, maybe there's a big storm coming, or if they're facing an animal conflict. A lot of animal stories are character versus nature. Another type of conflict is character versus character. This is pretty self-explanatory. This is the protagonist antagonist, when there's one character and they're facing another character. The last type of conflict is character versus society. Character versus society conflicts are when the character is facing either a societal system, such as stories of racism or slavery or any of those systems, but it can also be when the rules of society don't fit that person, when they're having trouble fitting in because their school or their country is different than they are. Many stories, in fact, most stories have more than one type of conflict going on. That's what makes a story interesting. If it wasn't for conflict, stories would be pretty boring. The next story elements we're going to talk about are moral and theme. Now, moral are lessons about life, and they're usually expressed in really simple stories like fables or parables. You probably remember reading like the story of the tortoise and the hare with the moral that, slow and steady wins the race. Those kind of fables and parables have very simple, straightforward lessons about life. A lot of times novels contain these where somebody within the novel is telling the story and it's part of it, but it's not sort of the total story of the novel. Instead, novels usually contain themes, which are sort of more broad insights about life, and they're kind of indirectly explored. And themes can be hard to nail down, but examples of themes might be things like friendship or loyalty or choices. They're sort of broad, but it's basically that you're learning some kind of insight about life through the story of the novel. Now, the last important story element is setting, and the setting is pretty straightforward. It's the time and place of the story. This includes things like the location, where in the world is it? The time period, is it past, present, or future? But it also includes things like the weather. Was it a hot day? Was it a stormy day? A lot of times that impacts how you feel about the story. If it's a beautiful sunny day, you often have a different feeling, a different emotional response to the story than if it's a dark and stormy day. Most novels have a lot of different settings. And so when you're talking about the setting of a novel, it's usually not just one thing. It's usually multiple places. The setting is probably one of the easier parts of a story to be able to describe, but it's very important to making sure you understand what's happening in the story. Well, that wraps up our discussion of story elements. As we're reading 13 Reasons Why in class, make sure you're paying special close attention to the narrator, the plot, the characters and how the author's using characterization, the theme, the setting, the conflict, all of those important elements, because I'm going to ask you about them.